Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another installment in the evening conversation series from the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House. My name is Kyff, and I am a museum educator at the Connecticut Democracy Center, and we'll be hosting tonight's program. We are the place where history and civics meet, and our goal is to share stories and ideas that help people understand our state and find ways to make it better. Treason, sedition, insurrection, inauguration, republic, democracy. What do all of these words mean, and how have their meanings changed over time? And how do these words impact the way we look at the world today? This evening, I'm happy to be joined by the word guy, Rob Kyff. Teacher, writer, editor, and language columnist, Rob Kyff is an expert with words. He also happens to be my dad. Through his weekly columns in several publications, a multitude of published books, as well as in his classrooms, he shares his language and grammar tips and provides fun facts about the evolution of the English language. Learn more about our democracy through the words we use. Welcome, Dad. We are so glad to have you here this evening. We hope that this will be an interactive program, so please post questions in the comment section and we will share them with the speaker towards the end of the program. Hi, Dad.
Hi, Allie. Nice to be with you.
Nice
Different setting, but very familiar.
Yeah, well, it's really good to see you too. So we can just start with the first question. Just a little bit about yourself to start. So could you talk a little bit about how you became interested in word origins and how your column came to be?
Yeah, I remember very distinctly, Allie, when I was in fourth grade. I had a teacher who told us that there were words that had changed in meaning over time, which I had no idea. And the word that she mentioned was the word nice, which used to mean cowardly and ignorant, and now, of course, means something very positive. And that got me interested. And I've always followed words and thought about them and analyzed them. And I was writing a lot of opinion pieces for the Hartford Courant as a freelancer. And they used to run a column by Michael Gartner called On Words. And I loved it. But he stopped writing it because he got a job as the president of NBC News. So I asked the Courant whether they might want to have a local person write a column on words. And to my surprise, actually, they said, yeah, that'd be a great idea. So it was one of those things of just being in the right place at the right time. And they knew me as a writer, so I had a little bit of a track record. So it's been a great joy for me. I've been writing it now since 1992, so almost coming up on 19 years. And 19 or 29. I'm not even sure. 29, I guess. It doesn't seem that long, but it's amazing. Now the column hasn't been appearing in the Courant for the last several months because of the pandemic. I hope that it'll be coming back soon. I don't know, but I still write the syndicated version for Creator Syndicate. But I think the thing that impresses me about the origins of words is how they can help you understand a word's meaning. For instance, if you know that inspire comes from the Latin word for breath, you can get a sense of what inspiration is. It literally gives you air and oxygen about something. Or you talk about courage. Courage comes from the Latin word for heart. So someone who has courage has a strong heart. Or even an interesting word is capricious, which means, whimsical. And that comes from the Latin word for goat, caper, like Capricorn. And a goat is a kind of lively, dancing around animal that frolics. And so that's where we get the word capricious.
Really interesting. Yeah, I guess I was going to ask you what are some examples of words that's meanings have changed over time, and then if you could talk a little bit about why words matter and what impact words have in the way we look at the world?
Well, they certainly do matter. One of the most fascinating anecdotes that I know regarding the changing meanings of words is when King James II saw Christopher Wren's St. Paul's Cathedral in London. This is in the 1600s. He said it's awful, artificial, and amusing, which today would be a very bad review, right? It sounds, he hated it. But in fact, back then, awful meant awe-inspiring. Artificial meant full of artifice, art, and creativity, and amusing meant amazing. So he really was saying it's awe-inspiring, full of artifice, and amazing. So that, just an example of some words that have changed. Even when we watch Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet in Shakespeare, when Juliet says, "Wherefore art thou Romeo?" a lot of people think she means, "Where are you?" But wherefore is an old word meaning why. So she's saying, why do you have to be Romeo, a member of the hated Montague clan? So she's not saying anything about where he is. She's saying, why does he have to be this? So it is interesting. One of the most fascinating qualities of words is some words can mean two opposite things. When we sanction Iran, for instance, we mean that we punish them or restrict them in some way. But yet, if the AAU sanctions an athlete, it means that he's legitimate, or he or she is legitimate competitor. Or when we dust a table, we take the dust off it. When we dust crops, we put dust on the field. So those are two great examples. And shifting a little bit more to this very serious, in world history, sometimes a word can make all the difference. And one of the most fascinating examples is that when the U.S. asked Japan to surrender in late July of 1945, they said, they suggested that they had, the powerful weapon of the atomic bomb, though they didn't say what it was. And the Japanese replied, "Mokyu satsu," which in Japanese can mean either we are considering it or we are ignoring it. And the translator who translated it into English, the Japanese translator, translated it as "we are ignoring it." And the US thought that they were rejecting their offer of peace. They asked them to surrender before they used the ultimate weapon. And so they dropped 2 atomic bombs based on that mistranslation. So hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives, and it changed the world because someone mistranslated a phrase. So that gives you an example of how words matter. I mean, there's a lot of controversy, for instance, about Donald Trump and whether he used the word fight and what he meant by that. And I mean, there's a legitimate debate about what those words meant, and it was the heart of the recent impeachment trial. So words make a big difference, not only in your personal life, but in the world, the wider world as well.
Awesome, thank you. So going into a little bit more about the democracy, so we're talking about the language of democracy. We hear words like republic and democracy thrown around a lot. So could you explain what each one of those really mean?
Yeah. Well, let's start with republic. Republic has a general and a specific meaning. In general, it means to any government that has a chief of state who's not a monarch. In other words, the leader of the state is not determined by inherited monarchy. But more specifically, it refers to a government in which the supreme power of the people its power resides in the people who elect officers who are responsible to them. So it doesn't mean that the people are directly voting on every issue. It means that they elect people for legislatures and as officers of the government, like the president, who ultimately are accountable to the people. It comes from the Latin word res, which means, it can mean many things, but in this case it means really an affair or matter, and publica, which is the feminine form of publicus, public. So it means matters of the public. Now, democracy refers to any government in which the supreme power is vested in the people, but exercised by them directly or indirectly through representatives. And direct democracy is when the people decide everything that by a vote, like a referendum. There's no intervening legislature or representatives. I think a good example of the combination of democracy and Republican government in our country is the Electoral College, because the will of the people is expressed, but they elect electors who then vote to reflect the will of the people. So there's an intermediary. They're not voting directly. And of course, many people want us to vote directly by popular vote, but the Electoral College was designed to protect the smaller states that had less population and to give them an equal voice in some form to the popular vote in the bigger states. And of course, it's reflected in the Senate and the House of Representatives as well, but we can talk about that in a little bit. It goes back to Greek democracy, when actually the ancient Greeks voted on issues by the whole body of men, voted in a popular vote to decide major issues of government. But our government is really a democratic republic. That means that it's a it doesn't have a monarch, and its decisions are filtered through representatives, but the people, that's where the democracy part comes in, are the ones who actually have power. So it's interesting because we've often been described as a democratic republic, and that's why, because people have power but not direct power in most cases.
And what are the origins of direct democracy?
Well, as I mentioned, they really come back to the Greeks, and there's quite a debate in our country between the people who want to have direct democracy. For instance, the debate over the Electoral College. Some people just want to have the people vote, and the person who gets the most votes of the whole country, regardless of states, will get the presidency or the vice presidency. And in American history, there's been a lot of energy around direct democracy, particularly during the Progressive era. And here's a good example of the difference. Until the 1913, U.S. senators were elected by the state legislatures. So people were voting for state legislators who then chose who would be the senator from that state, or the two senators from that state. So the will of the people was filtered through a state legislature, and in many cases those legislatures were corrupt, especially in the Gilded Age. So there was a movement to have direct election of senators by the people. There would be a statewide vote, and whoever won the popular vote would become the senator and just bypass the legislatures entirely. And that was called direct democracy. Other forms of it at the state level are referenda, which are votes directly on issues by the people, initiatives where the people can actually propose a law to put on the ballot and have people vote on it. And then there's the recall. If people in a state feel that their governor, for instance, is not doing a good job, they can petition and get a recall vote, and that's happened actually in California recently. Maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So those are called direct democracy because they derive directly from the people.
Mm-hmm. And are all republics democracies?
That's a good question. Yes. I suppose you could have, if you go by the general definition of republic, that is not having a monarch, you could say that if a person was chosen by some other form than the people voting, but he wasn't a monarch, that would be a republic without being a democratic republic. But the two I wouldn't say the two terms are interchangeable, but I would say that almost all republics today are democratic republics. And the power is expressed by the people, ultimately resides in the people.
Mm-hmm. So another few words I'm going to bring up now are other buzzwords that are also thrown around a lot. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between fascism and socialism?
Yeah, it's interesting. They overlap in some areas, but there are some kind of intuitive senses of them. Fascism, first of all, exalts the nation or race over the individual. It usually has a centralized, authoritarian, dictatorial government, a strong and charismatic leader, very strong control over freedom of speech and of the press, often nationalistic values. They celebrate heroes. The government doesn't own the economy, but it forces it to serve its interests, including the making of munitions and following government orders to do things. And it's sometimes opposed to international trade because they associate people outside the country as being inferior or undesirable. So there's a kind of a glorification of the state over the individual, very moralistic national values. I mean, we all think of Nazi Germany as the exemplar of fascism. Fascism is interesting because the origin of the term goes back to a symbol used by the Roman government in ancient Rome. Basically, the fasces was a bundle of elm or birch rods which were encircled together and then mounted on a pole. And at the top of the pole, or sometimes in the side of it, was the head of an axe. And it was designed to symbolize the power of the government. And the fasces were brought out, for instance, when there were tribunals and courts as a representation of the government's power. And that was picked up by Mussolini and people in Italy back in the late 19 teens. They used it as a symbol and they became known as the fascisti. And they used that symbol. And this is why, and they call themselves fascisti or fascists. And this is why the modern form of fascism exists. And of course, it represents a very strong, powerful government.
I'm just going to jump in here and put up a picture just for about 15 seconds, just so people can take a look. We do have the symbol outside of the old State House. Dad, can you talk about maybe a little bit, maybe why they might have put that on the fence in the early 19th century?
Actually, that's a great image because the the people who founded our republic in what's called the early republic period had a great admiration for the democracy, Republic of Rome. And they wanted to associate the American Republic with Rome. And when you look at the architecture of our Capitol buildings in Washington, you certainly can see the Roman influence in the columns and the Capitol itself and the White House. And it was a period that they saw Rome as a good example of a republic. So they would use fasces. In this case, this is on a wrought iron fence outside the old State House. You can see the axe at the top, and you can see the bands being held together, or the rods being held together by a band. I don't think they had that much snow in Rome. Maybe that's symbolic of the Mount Vesuvius, erupting and putting volcanic ash on it. But anyway, the point is that, it would be it doesn't really symbolize what we think of fascism today. It actually symbolizes the glory of the Roman Republic, which the old State House wanted to reinforce, to show that their form of government was similar to the Romans.
Great. And maybe just a little bit on socialism.
Yeah, socialism is basically more of an economic system than fascism. Fascism has elements of nationalism and glorification and often racism and culture. But basically, it just means that the government has a strong involvement in the production of goods and the distribution of goods and wealth. It doesn't necessarily mean that private property is abolished. I think in a lot of socialist countries today, there's a mix of private enterprise but it does mean the government has a lot to say about how wealth is distributed and created. Usually there's an emphasis on equality rather than, economic gain by individuals. And it puts the community at the heart of the system rather than the individual. So it usually results in a more equitable distribution of wealth, but also certain restrictions and rules that, a raw capitalist wouldn't go for. Socialism is thrown around now, allegations that anything that suggests government involvement in the private sector is somehow socialistic, which is, our country has from the time of the Constitution, when Alexander Hamilton created the National Bank and put in taxes and we were involved, the government was involved in economic enterprise, and certainly the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which gives the federal government the right to regulate commerce, interstate commerce, showed that we were never a country where there was just raw, unfettered capitalism. So socialism is a much milder political system, although it's interesting because the Soviet Union was technically named the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics because their economy was socialist. And communism is really just kind of a ramped up version of socialism, and usually it's in countries where their systems are derived from the beliefs of Karl Marx. So it's not really, it really is a form of socialism, but more intense. And I think one thing that communism often has is suppression of free speech and press, which is not true of socialism usually.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a few more questions to get through, so I'm going to move on to the next one. And this isn't really specifically about words, it's more about symbols. Since we were talking about the fasci and all the other ways that American architecture reflects Roman architecture, how come women are such often a symbol for democracy? And I'm going to put up an image to start of What is on the left, our original Statue of Justice that was on top of the building, I believe, until 1972, 1979, let's say 1970s. She has her eyes blindfolded, representing blind justice, holding scales and a sword. And then you see on the right, of course, Statue of Liberty. So why women? Why are women portrayed as the symbols of democracy in America?
Well, at the time of the revolution, women, see, one of the priorities of the framers was that men who were going to run the country, and unfortunately at that time the idea of women's suffrage was ahead of its time, but they felt that the raw instincts of men, their aggressiveness, their competitiveness, their selfishness, had to be tempered. For the republic to work, they had to be virtuous. That is, they had to put the good of the country ahead of themselves, and to act in ways that were unselfish. And women were seen as having the qualities that were needed in the men. They were considered to be milder. They were considered to be more temperate, more judicious, restrained, and virtuous. So women at that time were teaching their sons at home. There were very few schools, so people learned at home. So women were celebrated as being Republican mothers. There was a cult of Republican motherhood that suggested that women would provide the tempering influence over the aggressive, competitive men and ensure the virtue of the republic. I mean, part of it was that women were to choose as their husbands and boyfriends men who were virtuous. And if they weren't virtuous, if the men weren't virtuous, they could withhold sexual relations with them as a way of controlling them. So, there was a sexual element to it as well. So in our iconography of the period, if you look at the woman that you're showing now, she is dressed in Roman garb. That's a toga, essentially. And she's very ethereal, almost heavenly, like an angel. And she's bringing with her civilization. On the frontier, people wanted women to be there to make sure that there was culture, like the woman who brings her piano on the wagon train as a symbol of culture and the arts. She's holding in that painting actually a telegraph wire, which is interesting because it also means she's bringing progress. She's bringing technology. But you can see in all the images, from the Statue of Liberty to the ones you're showing here, this woman in these two panels is named Columbia, and she's asking, why should I allow these former Confederates in front of her on the left to be citizens again after the Civil War, and not have this man on the other side, who's an African-American veteran of the war, who's lost his leg fighting for the Union and for ending slavery. He should have the vote as well. And she's representing justice, mercy, tenderness, fairness, equality. And those are all qualities that were really celebrated in the American Republic all the way through, well, still are, but and the French, of course, gave us that gift of the Statue of Liberty in the 1880s because it was a symbol in the French Revolution of the French Republic. She represents liberté, and they gave us that as a birthday present for our 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 1876.
Mm. So moving, changing gears a little bit and going back to words and more recent events, it seems that the events on January 6th have been deemed an insurrection. Could you talk about the word insurrection and maybe some of the other words that we've used to describe the events on January 6th, or talking about the fact that nowadays, about a month and a half since the incident, the most common way to refer to the event is just the date itself, January 6th.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Ali, and you know, I've looked into a little bit to some of the. Let's start with the different levels of resistance and you know, revolt. You know, probably the mildest is an uprising, which is usually a limited, usually unsuccessful and brief form of defiance. Then a rebellion is usually more formidable resistance. It's usually aimed at evading an oppressive power or winning concessions from it. Revolt and insurrection are a little bit more intense. I think they're pretty much interchangeable as far as I'm concerned. They usually seek to overthrow, not just defy or evade, but to destroy an oppressive power and achieve a revolution. Insurgency is a more ongoing attempt to subvert political authority, but often by smaller incidents scattered even in remote areas, like the insurgency, you know, the Taliban insurgency in Afghanistan or the insurgencies in Iraq. So I think that insurrection is probably the best way to describe the events on January 6th. Revolt sounds a little too strong because it's, I don't know if insurrection, I think, is a little less organized than a revolt. And there's also you know, of course, there's the word revolution, which is a successful insurrection or insurgency or rebellion that leads to a major change in government or policies. So, you know, if the intent of those who attacked the Capitol was just to win concessions from the government, their actions were a rebellion. If their intent was to overthrow the government, then they would be a revolt or insurrection. And, you know, I think there was an element, now that we know more about it, of, you know, attacking people personally and revoking the decision of the Congress to accept the results of the election. So I have to say insurrection is probably an appropriate word there. You know, I think the idea of what to call it has been fascinating, because through January, most reporters and commentators were saying the events of January 6th or the insurrection or the attack on the Capitol. But in recent weeks, as you say, I noticed that people are calling it January 6th or just 1/6. And the same thing happened with 9/11. It's interesting. I actually wrote about this several times in September and October of 2001. That you know, it was called the Twin Towers attack. You know, I can't remember some of the other names, but people just called it by its date, which I think has kind of, it's good, because when you say a date, it conjures up the whole of series of events that happened on that date, and it's not just, you know, the fact that there was an attack, but it was the mayhem and the coverage and Trump's actions, and same with 9/11. You know, it was 9/11 happened in really three different places: Pennsylvania, New York, and Washington. So it conjures up the whole constellation of events that people experienced that day. And it's very interesting that our National Independence Day is called the 4th of July. which is, again, I think suggesting that the 4th of July wasn't just signing a document and declaring independence. It was a state of mind and a series of events that people think of and remember. So yeah, it's very interesting how what people call events, jumping. Well, I'll let you ask the
No,
question.
go ahead. If you want to jump to the Shays
Well,
Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion?
yeah, I wanted to talk about those rebellions because there were a series of rebellions, well, not series, but separate events, so separated by almost a Rebellion in Virginia in 1676, and then there was the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania. I'm sorry. Then Shays. I'm sorry. I jumped. Shays Rebellion was in Massachusetts, and then the Whiskey Rebellion in Western Pennsylvania, and they were called at the time. I tried to do some research to see when the term rebellion was used for each of these. And it seems that in the case of Bacon's Rebellion and Shays Rebellion, the term those terms emerged right away. Some say that Alexander Hamilton, originally people were calling the Whiskey Rebellion the insurrection or the Pennsylvania insurrection. And Hamilton shrewdly, we all know how smart he was. He decided to start calling it the Whiskey Rebellion, which has, as you notice from the picture, how disorganized, and they're tar and feathering this poor tax collector here. And he wanted to associate it with whiskey because he was trying to denigrate the whiskey rebels, implying in a way that they were drinking whiskey when they were rebelling, which probably mostly wasn't the case. I mean, probably some were, but it was over the issue of the whiskey tax, which was whiskey was used as a form of barter in Western Pennsylvania. So there was a lot of it, and they were being taxed, they felt, unfairly. But this actually brings up the idea of a republic too, because Washington and Hamilton's argument to the whiskey rebels, as opposed to Shays' Rebellion 10 years earlier, 8 years earlier, was that these men had representatives in Congress. There was a Congress, there were 2 senators from Pennsylvania, and there was a representative from the western part of Pennsylvania who did speak up for them in Congress. Now they were outvoted and the whiskey tax was put on, but their argument was you had representation. It didn't go your way, and this government means to enforce it. We're not gonna just let this go. A strong show of force actually dispersed the rebels without significant bloodshed. And they kind of skedaddled out into the hills, Allegheny Mountains, when the army approached. So it's interesting how Hamilton manipulated the name of the event. The Boston Tea Party is fascinating because the recent scholarship by a historian named Alfred Young found the first evidence of the term Boston Tea Party he could find was in 1834, which was almost 50 years, no, more than 50 years after the Tea Party was 1773. And he couldn't find any other evidence that it was ever called the Boston Tea Party. And he actually suggests that maybe people wouldn't feel comfortable calling it that because they took it so seriously at the time. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just a let's have fun and throw tea in the harbor. It was really a statement by the colonists that we are not going to take the British telling us what to do. In this case, they were telling them to buy their tea from Britain and none other. So maybe as the event became more distant in time, people were able to have some fun with it and refer to it as the Boston Tea Party. Another event in Boston 3 years before the Tea Party was the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1775, which interestingly, the Patriots called it the riot on King Street. But the Loyalists call it the riot on King Street, which has obviously negative connotations. It sounds as if, the people were rioters. But the Boston Massacre was invented right away by people like Paul Revere and Sam Adams as a term by the Patriots. The Patriots used to emphasize that the British had, suggested that they killed 5 Patriots in cold blood. So the manipulation of what events are called is really quite interesting.
Definitely. I'm learning so much. So could you talk a little bit about the word coup? And some people have described the insurrection as a coup. I know it's a French word. Could you talk a little bit about the word coup?
Yeah, well, I'll be on the lighter side here. Whenever you clip a coupon, that's a French word, and a coupon is something that's been struck out or clipped out, that you bring into the store. Well, that's what coup means in French. It means a blow or strike. And état means the state. So a coup is a blow or strike against the state. And it's successful. And, we had recently had one, not we had one, but the world has witnessed one in Myanmar, where soldiers come in and take over, or doesn't have to be soldiers, it could just be militias or guerrillas, but and completely overthrow the government. So coup is a strong word, a blow or strike. It's also used in the term coup de grace, which is a death blow. Gras means mercy. It's actually a stroke of mercy. The idea being that if someone was wounded, you were showing them mercy, heinously, severely wounded, you were showing them mercy by killing them. But it's a strong word, to say the least. It's usually, like a beheading or something like that. So coup is much stronger, I'd say, than insurrection or even revolt.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to we got a couple questions from Steve Courtney, and they're really good. And I'm going to put up the second one actually right now, and maybe we can answer his first one at the end of the program. It's going to cover our faces a little bit, but I just want everyone to see. He writes, Rob, during demonstrations in the 1960s, the term fascism was thrown around a lot, when really, though there was plenty of political bad behavior bordering on authoritarianism, the term didn't quite fit. In more recent events, the term seems more accurate, with the recent national government that seemed to be tempted by authoritarian impulses more blatantly. Does this seem accurate to you?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Steve. I agree. I think that I was, in my early 20s, or actually late teens and early 20s, when the not riots, but demonstrations, or some of them riots, going on. And I think a lot of the fascism charges would come from the police presence and the beatings that were committed by police, particularly the ones in Chicago at the Democratic Convention in '68. I think that my generation associated that, with the stormtroopers and Nazi Germany. A lot of our dads had served in World War II, so that it was an image and a memory that they'd shared with us. I think that, but it wasn't. If you look at the Johnson and Nixon administrations, you'd be hard pressed to find examples of real fascism as a form of government or a method of government. But the recent stirring up of racial hostilities by the president and his officials, the maligning of ethnic groups and opponents, the use of force, such as the episode where Trump ordered the police to just clear out a park in Washington so he could stage a photo op in front of a church. That's more, to me, more like fascism. So probably the rhetoric of the '60s was overblown, but I'm not so sure it was overblown in recent years.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have so many good questions. I'm trying to pick and choose just a few more. So I think I want to ask, where did the term Senate and House of Representatives come from?
Well, I just researched that today, Ali, and it's very interesting. The word Senate comes from the Latin word senex, which means old person. And the senators in Rome were generally older men. But it's quite interesting that our Senate, first of all, has a higher age requirement than the House. You have to be 30 years old to be a senator. And in fact, Joe Biden just got in under the wire when he was first elected in 1972. He's just had his birthday just a month before he was sworn in. So the Senate also, because the senators serve for 6-year terms as opposed to the 2-year terms of the representatives, they tend to be older people. I mean, you think about people like Mitch McConnell, some of these lions of the Senate. I mean, there have been some senators who've served for Strom Thurmond, I think, probably 50 years or something like that. So it's interesting that we choose that term for our upper house, which has an age requirement of higher and longer terms. Representative is an interesting term too, because it literally means from Latin to represent something. It comes from do it again, and presentare, which means to do it again. And I think that the case of representatives is that the people have spoken to them. So they're representing the people's ideas to the country, in form of laws. And the House is sometimes called the People's House because it's elected every 2 years. So the representatives are directly responsible to the people by popular vote within their districts. So they are accountable in a way that the senators aren't. One of the great descriptions of the House and Senate, which I've always liked, is the hot coffee of the House is cooled in the saucer of the Senate. That is, the House is where people's passions are hot, but if you to cool it off, you pour the coffee in the saucer. I mean, some people do that to cool off their coffee and then drink it right out of the saucer. But the Senate's there to kind of put an emergency brake on the hot passions of the day and bring some wisdom to the process. That's why they have primary responsibility for foreign affairs, because you can't have inconsistent policy in foreign affairs. The stakes are too high. You have to have continuity and consistency. So that's why the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is so important, and that's why treaties have to be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. So there's a real distinction linguistically and politically between those two terms.
Yeah. Now, okay, I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions in addition to Steve's question. And this is a big question, so maybe just answer it succinctly if you can. Constitution, what words or word were used to describe our new form of government? Were people saying republic, democracy, democratic republic? How has word choice changed over time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, there's a wonderful anecdote about the Constitutional Convention. Ben Franklin was the senior, speaking of senators and older statesmen, he was, well into his, I guess, 60s or 70s, I guess, because he died 3 years later. But anyway, they asked him, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. And what he meant by that is that they had decided not to have a king. Remember I said that the primary defining thing of a republic is that there's not a monarch. And there were people who thought they might emerge from the Constitutional Convention, having made George Washington the king, because he was respected and they just had a king and maybe they should go back to that, especially after the disaster of the Articles of Confederation. So they referred really mostly to the country as a republic in the first days, but they wanted to make sure that had a strong role in the government, so they called it a democratic republic. And one of the first parties opposing the Federalists were called the Democratic Republicans because they wanted to emphasize that the people had power. And they were a party more of the smaller farmers and craftsmen and not so much the businessmen and capitalists.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I'll ask this question. It's more of like a deeper question is these days it feels like people can ascribe any meaning they want to certain words if it fits a narrative they want to push. Language is more political than ever, and sometimes just using a specific word is more meaningful than the word itself. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, as I said earlier, Ali, I think that some of the language that's been used is very incendiary, and calling people traitors on both, it sounds like Trump here, but on both sides. We've divided our country with these labels. I mean, certainly Trump was a very skilled at putting labels on. Look what he did in the primary debates. He would put a word associate a word with one candidate, and that candidate would fold. Was it little Rubio and sneaky Cruz or whatever. He used nicknames, Sleepy Joe, he said so yeah, he was very skilled. I have to say that one of the things that's been underestimated about Trump is he has a very powerful sense of how to use words to humiliate people and incite people, not necessarily violence, but saying you're not going to have a country anymore. I mean, that's a phrase that's pretty basic to the republic, and people respond to language like that. So how we choose our words, moving forward is there are all kinds of ways in which both sides have manipulated words. I mean, one of the great examples is when the Republicans started calling the inheritance tax the death tax, implying that the government was taxing you because you were dying. That really hurt, the efforts to reform the inheritance tax. So, during you even look at the Civil War, to the Confederates, it was a war for states' rights, and it was called the war between the states. But the use of the term Civil War in the North suggested that we were still a country, because you can't have a civil war between two different countries. And Lincoln, never accepted the secession of the South. He called them states in rebellion, which is reflects his view that the Confederacy was illegitimate and the Union still existed.
This has been so interesting. I feel like we need a part 2 to discuss everything even more. Now, Steve's question is more of just a word question, but I think I'm interested in it, so I'm going to put it up on the screen. Rob, you have relayed so much about the richness of the language over the years. It's really appreciated by those of us who fiddle with the pen or the typewriter or the keyboard. My question, how can we stop using the terms 12 a.m. and 12 p.m.? This linguistic anomaly can cause endless confusion. Which is midnight and which is noon? Not as consequential as what you're discussing tonight, but an irritation nonetheless.
Well, that's so funny, Steve, because I get that question quite often. And, I actually get confused myself. I think it was only until about 10 years ago that I always have to stop and think 12 p.m. Now that's noon, right? Or I think so. I'm still not sure. Language is so funny how there can be a term that's confusing and it still exists for so long. A great example is the word moot. If you moot a point, that means you put it out there. But a moot point is one that's already settled. It's a contradiction. And yet we have to explain all the time, what that means. But yeah, I agree. I think people should just say noon and midnight. I certainly understand those terms. And I always get worried when I set my VCR. I set it to 11:59 p.m. because I know that's tonight. And I'm hesitant to, set it any past that because I'll get into trouble with the, with the time. So that's the joy of it, is that so many of the questions I get are very practical and seemingly mundane, but not so to a lot of people.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, we're running out of time. I'm so sorry. I don't think we're going to get to all the questions. But it's been such a good conversation, Dad. And
well, I'm happy to have it, Ellie. And anytime you want to have me back, I'd be glad to talk about it. One of the things I should mention is that even though I'm the word guy, I teach American history in high school. So I've learned a lot about the words in American history and what the meanings they have. So it's been a great fusion of two of my greatest interests, words and history.
Yeah. Well, we at the Democracy Center love both. So I just want to take a minute to tell the folks about some upcoming programs, including one or I think maybe two tomorrow night. So we've got the Encounters program, Origins of Hip Hop tomorrow night from 6 to 8 p.m. And then on Tuesday, February 23rd at 12 p.m., we'll be bringing Marcus Rediker, who's a scholar of the Amistad, to talk about his experience filming a documentary in Sierra Leone, visiting Sierra Leone. That will be really great. That's, again, next Tuesday at noon, same platform, just like this, Facebook Live. And then we are keeping our eyes on all the other programs going on along the Freedom Trail in Connecticut, including one tomorrow night at 5:30 at the Norwalk Historical Society, probably virtually, honoring the silent, documenting African American and Native American history in Connecticut. So those should be really good programs. Thank you so much, Dad, and thank you so much to everyone who tuned in. Hopefully we will be able to have you back soon, because I'm sure that there will be other events and things going on that we can discuss in detail as well.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I'm honored to be here.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.